show. We are going to be speaking today about animal hoarding. And what sparked this is a recent law review article on the topic. We have talked about animal hoarding before, many years ago, before the publication of the DSM-5, which gives hoarding disorder its own entry. Our guest is Courtney Lee, professor at McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, where she wears many hats, including teaching animal law. The article is titled, Never Enough Animal Hoarding Law. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what is your interest in animal hoarding? Why is this something you've written about?
Well, I started teaching animal law several years ago, and there was a small section of the book that discussed animal hoarding, and it was rather short, and I was intrigued after teaching the course, and I went to look further, and upon finding that there was such a high recidivism rate, I became even more interested, and just the more I dug, the more interesting it became. So that's what led to the article.
So one thing that we should do at onset is distinguish hoarding of objects from animal hoarding. So if you can give us an overview of that, please.
Sure. So there are overlapping tendencies between both object hoarding and animal hoarding. And some people hoard both objects and animals. They aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. However, one of the main differences between object hoarding and animal hoarding is the impacts of animal hoarding. They can be much broader and more widespread than object hoarding. For example, animal hoarding obviously harms the animals themselves, which can number into the hundreds. So that's hundreds of sentient beings that are being harmed and neglected. But also, animal hoarding can result in harms to neighbors and the community, as well as to the hoarder, him or herself. For example, animals will often, in large quantities, when they are not cared for properly, emit odors that will be unpleasant for those living nearby or in the actual structure. Ammonia from urine could cause major respiratory difficulties. Also, large quantities of animals living together are more prone to produce more zoonotic diseases, and whether those diseases are airborne or perhaps get into the water supply somehow, it can have a wide-ranging impact on the community. This is in contrast to object hoarding, which often anyone can hoard anything, but often the objects are newspapers, mail, bags, clothing, etc., that really could pose harm to the actual hoarder, him or herself, but aren't as detrimental to the surrounding communities, and certainly not to animals, unless that person also hoards animals.
Is there something about the underlying psychology that's been identified between those who hoard objects and animals?
There are some underlying psychological issues that are common to both object hoarding and animal hoarding. I'm certainly not a scientist, so I don't profess to be an expert in that area, but I know that often hoarders have the same obsessive-compulsive disorder tendencies. They may have ADD issues as well. Underlying, especially animal hoarding, but also to some extent object hoarding, is just the underlying compulsion to control the hoarder's objects and or animals. That also can be why animal hoarders often are found with carcasses of animals that have passed away in their care, because they have this compulsion to control. And unlike objects, animals don't last forever. Arguably, some objects don't either, but animals certainly do not. And often the hoarder is unable to let go of that physical remains of the animal that he or she has lost. So there are many cases where animal hoarders will be found living with hundreds of living and dead animals in their care.
You write about three main types of animal hoarders. Can you go through those? It's interesting that there are now discrete categories identified.
Yes, absolutely. And again, not every hoarder falls exactly into one category versus the others. There are some that overlap between categories. So first of all, there are what are known as overwhelmed caregivers. This is often the type of hoarder that's portrayed in the media more often than not. Overwhelmed caregivers mean they might start with just one or two animals. maybe someone drops off a stray or a litter of kittens or puppies or other animals, and the overwhelmed caregiver means well, is trying to take care of them. The hoarder might not spay or neuter the animals properly, and the animals reproduce, and it just becomes overwhelming to that person, hence the term overwhelmed caregiver. Often these overwhelmed caregivers are amenable to help, and if anything, they might even welcome intervention from agencies that want to step in and help them and help the animals. They are not very combative, typically speaking, and they are less likely to go back to their old hoarding ways once there has been intervention. The next category of animal hoarder is known as the rescuer hoarder. And this is one that can overlap a lot with overwhelmed caregivers. The rescuer hoarder might start as an overwhelmed caregiver, but if left to continue without any kind of assistance, might lapse into this rescuer hoarder category, which is someone who ultimately becomes delusional to the point that he or she believes that he or she is the only individual that can save these animals, the savior who is the only one who can provide proper care, even though in reality the hoarder is not providing proper care at all. The rescuer hoarder might begin by taking in animals and attempting to find them homes. Often that will devolve into determining that no other adoptive homes are good enough, and then that balloons into the delusion I just mentioned, where the rescuer hoarder believes that he or she is the only possible savior for these animals, and then the compulsion grows stronger, and they acquire more and more, and it just, again, balloons out of control. The third main type of animal hoarder is a lot more nefarious, and that this is someone known as the exploiter hoarder. There's one individual who came up in a lot of my research that typifies the exploiter hoarder. This woman is named Vicki Kittles, Kittles. She has left a trail of destruction and harm in multiple, I think it might have been like 5 different states. She, like the typical exploiter hoarder, is very savvy, very manipulative, and very familiar with the legal system. So even though she has been in court many, many times and even gone to prison, jail, she is able to manipulate the system, get out, and then go right back to hoarding once again. And again, I'm just using her as an example who came up in a lot of my research, but there are other examples as well. Exploiter hoarders, I think, tend to be less common than, for example, overwhelmed caregivers, but they do exist with enough frequency that they merit their own category. And then, of course, there are overlapping types and then some somewhat introductory hoarding types, if you want to call it that. They are the introductory kind of early onset hoarding stages are called incipient hoarding and breeder hoarding. And incipient hoarders may have animals and meet the minimum required standards of care, even if only barely, but are dangerously close to slipping underneath that line. And then often they might warp into overwhelmed caregivers. And breeder hoarders are to be contrasted with legitimate animal breeders who have legitimate organizations that do take care of their animals. Breeder hoarders breed animals for show or sale, and they continue to breed the animals even though conditions deteriorate and even though it becomes clear to an outside observer that they are not meeting minimum standards of care. If someone is to encounter an incipient hoarder or a breeder hoarder, if that person is able to intervene or that agency is able to intervene at that point, then it's a benefit to all involved because it can keep the incipient or breeder hoarder from ballooning into a rescuer hoarder or overwhelmed caregiver or, unfortunately, an exploiter hoarder.
You write that animal hoarding is widespread. Do we have a handle on specific numbers? Do we have estimates on how common this is?
Well, in the United States alone, there are incidents ranging from about 700,000 to 1.4 million hoarding cases. And that's not just animal hoarding, but hoarding in general, and many of those presumably are animal hoarding cases. But I didn't find any data specifically regarding animal hoarding itself. But it is a widespread problem, and it affects not only the United States, but also other countries as well. I've read cases, there's a famous case from Sweden of a woman who hoarded 150 swans in a one-bedroom apartment. There are cases in other European countries and Canada and elsewhere as well, but it is a widespread problem.
We're speaking with Courtney Lee, a law professor from McGeorge School of Law, about animal hoarding. And being that she is a professor of law, when we come back, we're going to be delving into the law just a little bit so we can understand how complex and challenging it is to deal with these cases. You're listening to Animals Today.